This video is sponsored by Gamer's Grass. It has been 3 years since my first foray into the world of Age of Sigmar, painting up the Stormcast half of the Dominion box, which I have then played with once over the past 3 years. But you know what has gripped me? Age of Sigmar 4th edition Spearhead. It's really good, and I've been playing it non-stop. I played in 2 tournaments. I won one, I got a trophy, and that has led me to dusting off these poorly used minis, because with Dominion, I've got the better part of another Spearhead. This Spearhead is actually the game's namesake, Yndrasta Spearhead. It's a mix of the Dominion box, including 3, no, they're not Terminators with hammers and storm shields, they're Annihilators with hammers and storm cast shields. A Knight Vexillor with a big old banner, and herself, the Fate Butcher, Yndrasta, Sigmar's monster huntress. And a mix of other kits, 2 squads of 5 Vanquishers, and a Stormstrike Chariot. I am really excited to get this force playable because it looks strong. And of course, Sean got the Slaves to Darkness, which seems a little OP and he's been tabling us for the past month, so I need a strong team. I want to play with this Spearhead, and I want to improve on my 3-year-old basically box art paint job, because it's fine, but it's not cutting the biscuits. It's not flimming my flams, if you know what I mean. There is something more I can do with these suckers, and to figure out what that is, I'm gonna throw a little bit more paint on these. I think this is something a lot of hobbyists can relate to. You've got some more guys and a lot more experience, but you have old guys, and you could paint the new guys to look like the old guys, but it would be a lot more fun to try something new, or at least new-ish. I tore my Hammernators off their bases. My old bases were also kinda lame, so I'm excited to try something new. Also, his toe snapped off. That's gonna need a fix. After fixing the foot and getting these models onto some paint handles, also known as little cubes of wood with double stick tape, I got to work experimenting. One paint I don't use much is this Bad Moon's yellow. It's a yellow that often looks a little green, but maybe it's just the thing for these Stormcast. I airbrushed this over the OG paint job and it added a ton of vibrancy. Now I want to play around with the shadows. I put contrast wildwood into my airbrush and sprayed this from below, darkening my shadows a lot. Now he's looking much more color saturated. It's time to introduce some brushwork. I put yellow, yellow white, and tan onto my palette. These Stormcasts are feeling like they need some non-metallic metal. I did some sketchy highlights of yellow on the raised areas, along the tops of his pecs, on his decorations, the top of his wrists, and anything that was really easy to reach with the brush. Usually to do this kind of metal, you would start from scratch with the idea of doing non-metallic metal everywhere. But here I'm putting this on top of basically a finished model, but I feel like it's looking pretty good. After the yellow, I put yellow white onto my paintbrush and put this on a little bit here and there on top of the yellow I put down previously. Just a little bit, and I decided I didn't even have to go for the tan color. The yellow white is way bright enough. Instead, I decided to move on to the shields and weapons. I took Grim Black Speed Paint and glazed this over the gunmetal parts to darken them in preparation for some lightning. I mixed up some white ink with some flow improver to make a white wash, and I dripped this into the cracks and recesses of the shield, getting it into Sigmar's eyes especially. Once the white paint was dry, I airbrushed some blue paint over top to get the white to look like some glowing blue energy, and after the blue, I airbrushed a little phthalo cyan green ink, which is a jade color, and this gave the glow a pop of green, which looked really good. I dusted this here and there everywhere to make the whole paint job a little bit more interesting. It didn't take too long to zhuzh up the mini, and I'm liking it a whole lot more. He's been sat on my shelf for the last 3 years, but now there's some new paint on him, and not even that much new paint. Maybe 15% of the mini is new, but he feels 100% different. Ooh, I like these new guys. And these new guys are just the old guys with more paint on them, but now I'm actually excited. I haven't been adding to my Stormcast army mostly because I would just make them look like my current collection, and my collection was fine, but it didn't make me excited to see that transformation. Part of the fun of collecting miniatures is seeing the gray models transform into painted models, and that just wasn't a transformation I was super excited to see happen, but now I really want to see the Vanquishers done up looking like this. I want to see the Stormstrike Chariot looking like this. And it's just fun to go back on old models and give them a little extra zhuzh, because it makes them feel like new models. Looking at the Knight Vexillor, I tried extra hard on his banner back in the day, but now I can try even harder. I used white ink to spray over the previous work, but not cover it up at all, just to get it a little bit brighter so there's more contrast between the darkest and the brightest parts. I threw some indigo into my airbrush and sprayed this in the folds of the banner to darken them, letting it hit on the white parts too, like the little text. This little bit of blue will make them look more interesting anyway, so I don't need to clean it up. And then I moved on to the red. I used my yellow white from the armor to do some sketchy highlights on the banner and then glazed red ink over top. This ink is the most saturated red I own, and over the warm white makes for as bright a red as I can make. I highlighted the trim and details on the banner with the same yellow and yellow white I used on the armor. Now that I got a little something extra going on everywhere else, I want to play around with the sword. I base coated it black and used the watery white I made for the Terminator's shields on the lettering, then cleaned it up with black paint. I used some masking tape in my airbrush to do some quick gradients and the same blue and teal inks to make the swords look like the shields. After that I did some lightning and it looks decently magical, a little busy though, I might switch it up on the other swords. The Vexillor is looking really spicy now, a real epic hero instead of the slightly taller Stormcast he used to be. 2 units down, 2 units to go, and it is time to paint up Yndrasta. And you might think that Yndrasta is just the Age of Sigmar version of Celestine, and I kinda thought that too, but I just finished reading Yndrasta the Celestial Spear by Noah von Nguyen, and it talks all about this character, and you see the world from her perspective. This is not Celestine. Yndrasta is arguably a bad guy, or not a bad guy, but not really a good guy. The book follows Yndrasta and some random peasant as their stories intertwine and how the two characters view one another. In the book, Yndrasta, she doesn't change, but she does grow as a person or as an angelic being. It's really, really interesting, and I am really excited to paint this model up again. Now onto the Huntress. I had to knock the dust and cobwebs off of her, and I airbrushed on the same yellow and brown to make her match the new guys. I tried especially hard on her back in the day, so she'll be a little bit easier to revamp. She doesn't need as much new paint, and her crazy armor takes to non-metallic metal really well. And because I'm painting over old paint, I can leave as much of the old paint showing as I want, letting it be good enough on all the spots I don't care much about so I can focus on the stuff like putting micro scratches and dings in her armor. Yndrasta takes a lot of punishment fighting the biggest bads in all of Age of Sigmar. One change I did make was to her eyes. I gave her normal eyes before, but now that I know a little bit more about her lore, I want to give her some magical glowing eyes. I rebase coated them in blue and worked them up to pure white with no pupils. Yndrasta is a little spooky in the lore, and I want that to come through on the model. And speaking of spooky, I'm not feeling her warm angelic wings anymore. In the lore it's mentioned that mortals can't even see her wings, so I want to make them a little more celestial. I used indigo ink on the outer edges and jade ink on the insides, finishing it off with the black wingtips. Now this is looking better, but as long as I'm experimenting, why not keep pushing it? I broke out the oil paint. Literally, I could not get the cap off. I made this into a wash and pin shaded all of her feathers. Trying this out on an old base, the capillary action seemed just about right, so I dripped this onto the model, cleaning it up as best I could with some makeup sponges. Well, I just gotta put Yndrasta aside while I wait for the oil paint to dry. Hopefully it won't take ages. It's probably gonna take ages. And it would have been a lot easier if the wings weren't already glued on, but alas. It is now time to see if I can make the brand new guys look like the old new guys. I don't really have a scheme per se, just a finished result I would like to end up at, so I started off with a black prime. I know my guys should be an orangey yellow, so I did a zenithal of an orangey brown and then a stripe of yellow from above on all the new minis. Then a blasting of a watered down gold. Even though I'm sort of doing non-metallic metal, I feel like the metallics underneath are still doing something for me. I put an Agrath Earthshade wash over everything and then base coated all the cloth with blue, using a blue wash to shade and a sponging of some light blue paint to start laying on some texture. The cloth of these Stormcast is very rubbery looking because it's hard plastic, so anything I can do with paint to soften them is good. I use my airbrush to highlight with just a little bit more light blue. Now that I have my colors down, I can treat them just like I did my old minis, hitting them with the contrast paint tints and then loading them up with non-metallic metal using yellow and warm white. Now, are the Stormcasts lame? Kinda. The army doesn't grip me a ton, but I think a lot of that has to do with the Games Workshop paint jobs. Good old Games Workshop made Fantasy Space Marines, and they painted them all like Space Marines, with every part getting a color. All the armor, gold. All the straps, brown. All the cloth, blue. This leads to very bland models. This style happens to look good on Space Marines, but if you notice, Games Workshop does tend to slip away from this for all of their other minis. On the Genestealer cult, for example, there are some glazing and non-metallic metals, freehanding, sponging. It's subtle because Games Workshop wants you to think it's as easy as put color in the right spot and it'll look like this. But Games Workshop doesn't let their artists splash out like this on the poster boys. I think if you abandon the formula and do some fun, interesting painting on the Stormcast, they become a lot more interesting. Kinda just the same way Space Marines do. Box art Space Marines look pretty good, but they start to look really good when you mix it up. And Stormcast are just about the best possible practice for non-metallic metal out there. If you want to learn non-metallic metal, the big, blocky geometric shapes that make up the Stormcast are perfect for messing around and learning exactly where to put the highlights. Now that the armors are done, it's time to finish these suckers off. The Vexillor sword gave me some ideas, but I want something a little bit more striking. After a black base coat, I dry brushed some dark gunmetal to get something a little swordy to work up from. Then I took my whitest ink and my best paintbrush and got to sketching on some lightning. Doing little wiggly lines running up the length of the blade and dripping white around the pommel to make it look glowy. I airbrushed some blue and green inks onto the blade to make them magical and then reinforced the lightning with a little bit more white. I did have some practice from 40k power swords, but these aren't power swords, these are magical swords, completely different. Now the only thing left are the Griff Chargers, the bird lion horses of the Stormcast. I zenithalled them with a warm white color and then got to work painting them. I used wild wood on their manes of feathers, which is the same color I've been using to darken my Stormcast armor. And now to make them a little extra special, I painted some stripes on their butts, like okapis, one of the weirdest animals ever. I did a little dry brushing of the orange-brown that I've been using on my palette for the Stormcast armor. Reusing all these colors will help make them feel a part of the Stormcast world. I made little stripes on the horns of the Griff Chargers, adding in a little bit more detail than was actually on the models. And for their beaks, I made them bald eagle beaks. Bright yellow with a little shading of orange-brown and some highlights of warm white. And speaking of not enough detail, the top of their heads are just flat and smooth, which feels wrong. They should be feathered. So I took some contrast paint and made a bunch of little dashes, making up their head of feathers. After I airbrushed their paws with some brown, I did a little highlighting on the straps to make sure that they were a little bit different from all the other browns on the creature's bodies. Then I could stick it all together and Yndrasta's Spearhead is nearly ready to face Sean. With the chariot now done, I have given the most possible number of hours in between applying the oil paint and continuing to work on it. It is time to see if my foray back into oil paints was a disaster or not. The white ink did dim just a little bit as it's been drying for the last couple of days. I took my white ink and did some lightning bolts coming out from under the feathers here and there, and then I sprayed them with the yellow contrast that I've been using, and then jade and indigo inks to give them the same magical flair that the rest of my Stormcast weapons have. Alright, I got 16 models with bright yellow paint jobs and jade accents. The question is, what would look good for the bases? Off the top of my head, I don't really have any ideas, but you know what I do know about? That's right, EonsOfBattle.com. EonsOfBattle.com is the place to find our merch like the new Nick and Jay dice and the best way to support us doing what we do with a membership. Each month, members will get a credit that they can use on our new monthly terrain packs or any previous pack we have ever made. For the month of October, we have expanded on our orc terrain with the Orc Rocket Factory. Fill your game boards with ramshackle walls and a grizzly gate with an explosive flare. Man the battlements of an orc's weapon workshop absolutely dripping with bombs, rockets, and pointy missiles. This modular terrain is fully compatible with our previous orc brewery and the Octeris terrain and can be assembled into all sorts of shapes, ready to detonate at a moment's notice. I got out all the bases I need, and Stormcast stand on big ol' 40mm bases, and the chariot is on a 120mm oval, so I have lots of room to work with. I took 1/8 inch cork and 1/4 inch cork and covered the bases randomly, leaving some empty so that there's some variety in base heights. I used my Dremel tool to carve into the bases, giving them uneven surfaces so they look more natural. In some spots, I used Milliput to build up the ground to make the cork transitions more smooth, and I covered everything in texture paste. Now for some decorations. I used some big fish tank rocks for some boulders, sprinkling on some small pebbles, and I saturated the bases with Elmer's glue to lock it all down. Now for paint. I put some browns into my black primer and covered up everything, including Yndrasta's base. I didn't bother getting rid of the old static grass, it won't hurt anything. After that, I sprayed some brown in patches over the bases for variety. Then I turned the PSI of my airbrush way down so the paint just splatters out, and I sprinkled some light brown and tan over the bases to give them a ton of texture. After that, a dry brushing of tan to highlight the rocks and cork, and all of this was in preparation for my final scheme, jungle. I haven't tried jungle bases in forever. I used a dusting of neon green to tint the bases, and then a more selective airbrushing of dark green contrast paint to get the vibrant green jungle floor I was after. Now while my bases are empty, I glued down my miniatures, using super glue under the feet and then using some ultra thin super glue to give a little extra strength. This flows all around and under their feet and hopefully sinks into the cork. Now that my models are standing, I need to fill in every available inch with stuff. And I have a lot of stuff. Grass tufts and plants from Gamer's Grass. I've played around with these flat plants and they are pretty great. They come with printing that's better than I could do with paint, and they just need to be punched out and shaped. These plants are printed onto plastic so you can crinkle them in your fingers and they keep their shape. I bent them up until they were standing tall and then super glued them in place. It's hard to find basing bits that offer a lot of height, and these plants give some really nice dimensionality to the base, which is great for making nice full jungles. Speaking of full, I used some big old bushes to fill in some of the larger spots and some abstract shaped tufts for everywhere else. On the ancient rune that Yndrasta is standing on, I used some moss tufts. These are super sticky and take well to being formed around the shapes of the staircase. Then I gave another laser plant a try, some ferns. This filled in the middle of the base nicely. Now that I have some experience with Yndrasta's base as a template, I can work on doing the same thing on everyone else's bases, using a mix of grass tufts everywhere. One trick I discovered on the flat plants is to take the foam they come with, roll it into a tube, and then use this to help crush the plants into shape. I got pretty quick at it. On this whole spearhead, I used up 2 sheets, Gamer's Grass laser plants Bracken and Monstera. Gamer's Grass has every shape and color of plant imaginable, and I've been using their tufts for years. The The infantry bases were a little trickier to get the big plants on, but what's nice about Spearhead is I have some nice big bases to add context for the smaller guys. Now one last trick I have is to dust on some neon green over all the plants. This will give them a little dusting of super saturated green, bringing them a little closer together in hue and splashing on the model's feet and legs, helping to integrate them into their environment and make them feel more natural. After a quick ring around the base frames, I have a whole new army, one that I've owned for years, again. My Stormcast Eternal army is finished again. This is probably my most shameful army because I painted and completely finished a whole army and then used it in exactly one game. But that's not necessarily true because yesterday I actually played a game of Spearhead, proxying these guys because they weren't quite done yet, but it was glorious. Proxy Andrasta showed up and threw Thangovar her spear and did 11 damage to a tree lord, finishing him off in close combat. It was glorious. And now I get to try again with a fully painted collection. It's taken me a long time to warm up on the Stormcast Eternals. They really are the Space Marines of Age of Sigmar, but I do like the Space Marines. And these guys were much more fun to paint because before, just slapped gold on there in a wash. Now, well, I still slapped gold on there in a wash, but then I did a bunch of other stuff and now they look really cool. With Yndrasta's Spearhead complete, that brings me up to 3 completed Spearheads and only 3 more to go. And one of those 3 is Fire Slayers. Yeah, I gotta try to figure out how to make Fire Slayers look good. Leave a comment if you have any ideas. A big thanks to Gamers Grass for sponsoring this video and making every possible variety of grass tuft. I gotta get back to gaming because I gotta get the reps in to beat Sean. Thanks for watching.